I'm Blas Perez Enriquez. I'm affiliated to the Bill Lane Center, where I direct the project that focuses on innovation in energy, water, and infrastructure. I also lead a program called Mexico Clean Economy 2050 that is run through Stanford Energy, and I teach in the public policy program. We're gonna now have a conversation about the U.S. Mexico border, and I'm gonna tell you what we're not gonna talk about. We could talk about it in the Q&A, but not from the start. As you know, normally during political electoral cycles, we tend to focus on the problems of the border, especially migration, drug dealing, gun traffic to Mexico. And this is just increasing. Just this morning, when I woke up, I saw that the Tucson sector has become the new hotspot for immigration, undocumented immigration. I did the search of immigrants now crossing through the desert, which is a very dangerous area. It has increased mostly because of the aggressive policies that Texas is taking against illegal crossings. And this is bringing people from all over the world. They interview 4 people, 1 from South America, 1 from the Caribbean, Aruba, and 2 from Nepal. I was surprised, really, really far away from this region, but they're all coming for opportunities. And this is also happening in California. We see more Chinese immigrants, economic immigrants, crossing the U.S. Mexico border in that area. So a lot of people are coming in, stressing our national border and Homeland Security institutions. We don't really know who all of them are, so it also brings a national security risk. And so we right now have the opportunity to also look at other developments, which is, the U.S. has a new vision on realigning its relations with China, and bringing in resources to become again dominant in technology, especially the key technologies and areas that will allow for the energy transition and digital and smart systems integration into our industry to become much more competitive. And this includes also the USMCA or NAFTA partners, Mexico and Canada. The world is coming to the border. They're building up industrial capacity, logistical centers, and data centers in Mexico in preparation for these. We will talk about that. So basically, we will talk about the opportunities. And this is going to stress the natural resources of the area, but also it will create opportunities for developing advanced infrastructure, have governance structures that allow us for smart resource management in the region, and a lot of economic development. And this will be obviously a key driver for the change and evolution of the southern part of the rural West. And with that, I will briefly introduce our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Gemma Smith. And I would like to say that all of our panelists have a Stanford connection. Gemma is a recent graduate of Stanford. She holds a joint appointment as assistant research professor at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy and assistant professor in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. Gemma will discuss the role of institutions for regional collaboration and reliable partnerships to develop novel solutions to transboundary water resource management in the U.S. Mexico border. Then we have, on the end of the table, Christopher Scott, who holds the Maurice K. Goddard Chair in Forestry and Environmental Resource Conservation at Pennsylvania State University, and he's a Stanford dad. He will discuss opportunities for smart resource governance and the challenge that divergent policy approaches at the federal and local level pose to the region and in general our binational economy. And finally is Salvador Lopez Cordova, fellow countryman from Mexico, who serves as the first Chief Environmental Officer of the NatBank. Salvador will talk about the work of this regional development bank, a green bank that was created during the NAFTA negotiations that develops and finances infrastructure and capacity building along the U.S.-Mexico border to enhance environmental quality in the region to improve the quality of life of border communities. And I think Chris will start with his presentation.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe while that's queuing up, I'm the only speaker on your dais. I checked this from east of the Mississippi, so you're probably wondering why I'm here. And there are two things. One is I am also the Emeritus Director of the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy. You heard from my colleague Andrea Gerlach this earlier today, and Gemma is also now associated with that center. But more importantly, I'm a Stanford dad. My daughter's doing the PhD in EIPR and is also a first-year law student. So just for the record. I wanted to talk with you and set the stage, and I know we'll have some more detailed comments that will build on some of these points, but also explore some new points. Let's think of borderlands not as defined by the sharp border, but really as binational regions, right? And so we heard a little bit that Mesoamerica, and obviously this is a broad region, which is clearly bisected by a border, but the border does divide the two countries, but really it also serves as the meeting point, right? Two countries come together at borders, just as they are divided by borders, for exchange of people, cultures, trades, a whole series of things. We're also very interested in the ecosystems, climatic. We've heard about some of the shared waters and other things. I'd also like to talk with you a little bit about the energy landscape that we also share and that is changing very dramatically as we speak. And let's not forget the point that borders also are used for political purposes within countries. You know, just as Michael Crow said, if you thought you understood Arizona, you're here to, you know, be disabused of that notion. The same thing that politicians in national capitals, I think, really use borders as punching bags unfairly, I think, you know, for political points, and I think we need to counter those narratives. And that happens not just in Washington, D.C., I think it also happens in Mexico City, in this case, but in similar contexts in other places. And more broadly, I think this question of resource security is something that both countries really are striving for. So on the maps theme that Andrea was talking about this morning, you can trace the political lines here, but you can see much broader regions at play, and including the American West. You know, that doesn't stop at the U.S. Mexico line, nor does it stop at the U.S. Canada line per se. And so I think we need to understand these things that really transcend political borders. I wanted to turn our attention to U.S. trade. Blas talked a little bit about nearshoring and onshoring, partly as a U.S. strategic policy to counter rivalry with China, trade and political rivalries. But you know, it simply builds on a long-standing set of trade relations in Mexico. But this has been changing very, very quickly. You can see the bar chart at the bottom left, exports and imports. The U.S. exports less to Mexico than it imports from Mexico. I would bet you that in the next year or two, that figure is going to cross $1 trillion a year. Right now, it's at $800 billion a year. If you break that down a little bit, I just happened to look at the January numbers, and that sort of box figure at the top right shows what the U.S. imports from Mexico. Not surprisingly, passenger vehicles, assembled goods, motor vehicle parts, computers, insulated wire and cable. So a lot of Mexico's manufacturing capabilities are critically important. Look at oil, though, and crude oil is actually one of Mexico's larger exports to the United States. So we start seeing some energy dimensions, but look at the bottom right-hand figure, and this is what the U.S. exports to Mexico just in January. And the total value of that box entirely is something like $40 billion in the month. And just of the exports. And so gasoline and other fuels, clearly motor vehicle parts, but you see LNG, petroleum, and a range of things that are really centered on this emerging energy economy as an important part of the trade relationship that has very rapidly changed. Here's how the U.S. State Department characterized it in 2022. Mexico remained the second largest source of foreign crude oil to the United States, as well as being the top destination for U.S. petroleum exports and U.S. natural gas. So U.S. is exporting natural gas, including liquefied natural gas across the Atlantic to Europe primarily, to wean them off of Russian natural gas. But natural gas is also an important part of U.S. exports. Some of that is produced in the binational region in Texas and other locations, and others also in my new home state of Pennsylvania with fracking and underground fracturing, hydraulic fracturing. Now, my question is whether the binational, and some of these are also trinational organizations, really envisioned these kinds of future scenarios around trade And are we collectively through these institutions served by and addressing this current and emerging reality of energy being a very large part of the binational economy and the binational trade? And I would say that we aren't, and I think we need to really think about that in institutional but also in political terms of how we actually look at not just goods and services traded, but particularly when it comes to energy. And so the question I'd like to pose for you now while I go through some facts and figures is, how can we envision a new binational energy landscape? And with engaged public and private sector institutions, clearly the private sector is going to play a leading role. I'm going to make the case that it shouldn't play the sole or the only role, that there is a strong need for public sector and governmental involvement in that process, but also as a means to build shared trust and meet both countries' goals and objectives in a way that addresses both social and environmental vulnerabilities. I put a question mark at the end, but you can see I'm putting it to you as sort of a statement, not of fact, but I think it's a challenge that I would like us all to think about. It's important to understand the divergent energy policy landscape in the two countries. Public administration in Mexico is more centralized, generally speaking, than in the United States, not in all cases, but the role of the federal government and the state governments in the United States for natural resource questions like water that we heard about for the Colorado River, but also in this case for energy and for food, which I'm going to touch on very briefly in this broader context that Blas is a clear leader on, in this water, energy, food nexus interaction of these critical resources. And the United States tends to be more decentralized, with federal government delegating responsibilities for critical resource management issues to the states in a fashion that's more decentralized at the state level than happens in Mexico. So there's some asymmetries or some marked differences at those political borders. I think it's important to really understand, and this is Isidro Morales from the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, but who was at Rice University at the time when he wrote this, of really trying to think through what models exist for policy and administration, particularly of energy, because I think it's the new challenge and the new question from this binational resource management and policy perspective. The rapid development of U.S. shale oil and gas, particularly in the last couple of decades, has really changed that, very significantly upended the status quo. So the institutions that we have, NADBank include, that we'll hear about from Salvador in a moment, as well as other trade commissions and so forth, are not well geared to deal with this increased trade in energy. But clearly, from an energy security perspective, this is an important development. I think the one that should be embraced, but I think we need to do some good institutional thinking and following that institutional design to be able to address those questions in the most appropriate way. On the electricity side, it's interesting that the United States is much more integrated with Canada than it is with Mexico. There are some points of cross-border electricity trade with grid integration at places across the border. I think this could be an additional area for collaboration between the two countries, in this case, Mexico and the United States, and the implications that has for the Southwest. I won't talk as much about this because I think Gemma is going to refer to this, and Salvador as well. We heard a little bit about this for the Colorado River piece, but you can also see that not just rivers are shared, but on the right-hand side, all of those are aquifers, underground water bodies where the line bisects the resource and both sides are using it with one degree of exploitation or another, but with some lack of coordination. So again, I'm not going to touch on that as much, although when I was at Arizona for a number of years, that was my primary area of interest. I've been a little bit of a geographical nomad, having come to Arizona from other places internationally and done work in Latin America and Asia and other places, and I find myself now on the East Coast. But also I'm a little bit of an academic, thematic nomad, that I am now picking up some work in energy where I was not trained in that. And so I'm really trying to look from a resource policy and governance and also resource security perspective. What I'm interested in this particular case is to understand Mexico's trade relations at the border. And there's a much broader set of questions than trade itself, but I think this is a good indicator of the degree to which the two countries work together or need to develop better ways to work together. On the food side, Mexico is a larger exporter of food to the U.S. than the reverse, though the U.S. does export a significant amount of agricultural commodities to Mexico, and you can see where the breakdown sort of is. As we talk about the rural Southwest United States and the viability of the farming sector in rural communities, I think many of these same questions apply across the border in Mexico, and not just at the line, but again in this notion that I've presented of a binational region. So trying to understand motivations for binational collaboration. Sorry, this is a little text heavy, and if I would have spent a little bit more time on the plane instead of reading my students' theses, because this is now the big season for professors to, have defenses and read master's and PhD and undergraduate honors theses that took up I would have thinned these out a little bit, but I do want to say that trade in this transboundary region is critically important. There are external factors that are critically important drivers. We've talked about the role of climate change, economic growth, and with that, population growth, but also these political and economic factors, I think, that really forge this relationship and also offer the opportunities for new ways of thinking. I had the opportunity to serve as a committee chair for a binational consensus study of the national academies in the United States and the Mexican Academy of Sciences. And this was a first for the U.S. Academy and also for a formal report done in this fashion. There have been lots of collaboration between the two countries' academies, but to put together one committee to do one report in English and in Spanish, and this came out 2 years ago, and we released this. And I wanted to bring some of these back up because there was a lot of interesting thinking and discussion and debates. And by the way, this was before that real upward inflection of the energy trade kind of component. So I think our committee would have rethought some of this. We tried to pitch this in the Sustainable Development Goals framework, because this is internationally at least recognized, if not fully accepted and adopted by all our parties. Mexico, I think, has adopted and embraced the SDGs more so than the United States. Within the United States, in public sector institutions, it's actually the National Academies of Sciences that I think is ahead of the curve in looking at what the SDGs actually do and bring to the conversation. There are 17 SDGs. The 17th, the last one, is the Partnerships for Sustainability. And this is critically important. We heard sustainability as a driving charge of the charter of Arizona State University from President Crow just now. So don't think of SDGs solely at the planetary level or even at the national level. We need to think about those at the institutional and even more local levels. Our consensus study concluded that the binational region, not the border lands, but the binational region that the borderlands are embedded in, faces these incredibly important challenges to safeguard resources while also pursuing economic vitality and livelihoods, preserving cultural richness and this unique environment. Growing demand, potential for binational industrial, energy, and mining sustainability partnerships. We had a mining sector representative on that binational committee. I think had we redone it, we would have asked for somebody from the energy sector to come and join us on that panel. And that would have changed some of our discussions. But navigating these sustainability challenges is critically difficult because it requires new ways of thinking and new governance norms and new institutions to try to do that. And some of that may be looking at examples of success or failed institutions and what that may mean for our future going forward. We found that there was inadequate data sharing, that each side, both sides, every side generates their own sort of data, and how that feeds into public policy decisions in that evidence-based policy approach and framework often starts with very different sets of data and information. We need to do a better job of sharing. Community relations are critically important. We've heard about the line was drawn across communities, literally across individual towns and cities, but more broadly across this region. And of course, in that very important set of links are indigenous communities that have populations and members of tribes that live on both sides of what is now the U.S. and Mexico border. The institutions of higher education, Stanford, ASU, Penn State, University of Arizona, all of our Texas A&M universities play a key role in knowledge production and not only training and education, but really bringing information and new ways of thinking to sustaining these, to promoting these sustainability partnerships. And the partnership persistence is critically important. It's not a one and done. You can't say we've got a commission now, we've got a collaborative mechanism, and the game's over. No, you have to keep pursuing those, and you have to keep reinventing those. Partners will fall out of alignment. We will look for new ways to share agreement. There will be new dimensions to our relationship, like this energy trade change that has recently come. And then finally, it's critically important to put on our thinking hats. We are, after all, here, at least in this room, mostly from institutions of higher education. There's a privilege we have. We find ourselves actually in, not many people get to spend a good part of their day or their academic or their career being sort of creative thinkers of really puzzling over things and learning. I spent a number of years after getting out of graduate school before coming to an academic job, about 10 years out, and really came back because there was the learning environment. There were critical questions being asked, and the objective was not to get the answer, but it was to ask the question, and in that process, learn and of course, devise answers as well. Trust, balance, and organizational power dynamics. So a number of things that I think that are critically important, but partnerships of the kind that we're talking about to revitalize the American Southwest, and with that, the northwestern Mexican region that I'm making the case is critically part of the region, really requires a sustained set of commitments and a sustained set of partnerships. Thank you very much. Here's my email if anybody would like to email me, and I'll be glad to take questions when it's back to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Fabulous. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining, and thank you for maintaining attention in this final session of the day. Really appreciate it. My name is Gemma Smith. As Blas mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. And if you're wondering what Chris is doing here as someone from the Northeast, you're definitely wondering what a Brit is doing in this space. But I work on environmental governance and specifically focusing on how we design transboundary collaborative institutions that foster collaboration in water management with a focus on the U.S. Mexico border. So that's why I'm here. And I wanted to just start off with picking up where Chris left off, talking about the strategies for building binational sustainability partnerships between the US and Mexico. And I think the recommendations that the report that he shared are really fundamental to any complex governance problem, but especially when we're talking about building stronger institutions in these transboundary environments. And I think they're spot on in terms of emphasizing that importance of trust building, managing power dynamics, and also providing stability and predictability, both horizontally across organizations operating at the same levels and vertically working from the very local to the federal and national government level as well. So building trust, managing power dynamics, and bridging across these horizontal and vertical governance chains are the central focus of a method of governance that's increasingly popular around the world, but particularly in the US and to a growing extent in Canada and Mexico as well, which is called collaborative governance. It's a big focus of research. And I will say up front that, I think often when people hear collaboration, collaborative, it sounds a little bit all sunshine and rainbows and we all hold hands and things magically work out. That is definitely not the case, and I'm glad that I'm speaking after the Colorado River panel because, you really see, the importance of the collaboration and, you really cannot do these things without close collaboration among multiple partners. But, it can be contentious, it's difficult. I don't think anybody in this room is naive enough to think that collaboration just happens. We can build trust and it all falls into place. So using these collaborative institutions in a transboundary context is absolutely crucial. If we're working domestically, then if the collaboration doesn't work out, well, we can just sue each other at the end of the day. So we've got that backup option. But when you're coming up to the edge of the political jurisdictions and the boundaries, we do not have that option. We have to collaborate. It has to be a central mode of being for how we do work in these transboundary regions. And I think using collaborative governance approaches can be incredibly powerful for building the trust that Chris was talking about, for trying to manage power dynamics across multiple levels. But there are significant challenges to doing this well, and especially, again, in the transboundary context. Collaboration can be a very intensive, slow-going process. There are all these divisions and power dynamics to be managed. So for those who are designing these transboundary collaborative institutions, the level of attention to detail that needs to go into every interaction, about the micro interactions that are happening between collaboration participants day in and day out as they work on this, can be really, really impactful. So the image that I've got up here, this map, this is from a global study where we looked at transboundary river organizations that were using collaborative governance processes in every transboundary river institution in the world. So just trying to get a handle on who is using collaboration and what are the forms and institutional design choices that are happening there, and what can we learn from the comparison between them. So I'm going to talk a bit today kind of from the very, very micro level to this very, very macro level. I want to put the U.S. Mexico border into this broader context of, how are we designing these institutions in the U.S. Mexico context, and what can we learn from other cases? And then getting to the very, very micro of, individual institutional design choices, down to what order are we putting speakers on the agenda, where are we choosing to hold these meetings. These kinds of things can be really impactful for the experience of collaboration and how we build trust. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that the US and Mexico already have some of the most innovative and wide-ranging transboundary governance arrangements in the world for freshwater management and the environment. So I think it's really important that we don't forget this. And I've put the logos of just a few organizations up here, but this is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to transboundary collaboration in the US-Mexico border region. So I've highlighted here, we've got, of course, the North American Development Bank, which we're going to hear more about from Salvador in just a minute. This is a crucial vehicle for providing binational financing in support of the development and implementation of environmental infrastructure projects. The IBWC, SILA, which is the International Boundary and Water Commission, which is responsible for applying the Boundary and Water Treaty between the US and Mexico, and has managed to continue evolving since it was first founded in 1944 through minutes to the original treaty that allow it to keep responding to emergent issues. We also have the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which was established as part of the Environmental Side Agreement to NAFTA, which was itself one of the first trade agreements to explicitly link the environment and the obligations to the environment and trade. And then finally, the Border 2025 program, which is just the latest iteration of a decades-long partnership between the US EPA and the Mexican Ministry for Environment and Resources, SEMARNAT, which has fostered collaboration on the border environment, on environmental and public health issues across communities along the entirety of the border. So each of these organizations are innovative in their own ways, and as I say, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is a huge amount of collaboration happening, between transboundary NGOs, individual communities, basically at every level of governance that you could think of, and nearly every sector imaginable as well. And kind of what we found from this global study is that the richness of this institutional environment and collaboration is perhaps surprising, given how unusual the US-Mexico border is when we take that global view of collaboration worldwide. So the US-Mexico border was in fact the case where we had two of the most different nations in the data set sharing a border and being able to collaborate in such different and interesting ways. So in this study, we found that a major predictor of whether nations would adopt collaborative governance approaches with one another was if they had more decentralized political systems to begin with. So, they were already used to domestically working across multiple levels of government and engaging with non-state actors in the private sector as well. And so the US and Mexico had the largest difference between them of any of the cases in the data set when it came to the level of political decentralization that they have in their respective nations. Obviously, the US is kind of an extreme case of very clear political decentralization. And although Mexico is also a federal nation, it's, at least comparatively, really quite centralized in terms of especially its fiscal and administrative decision-making. So this asymmetry between the two countries can present a challenge when trying to collaborate, and especially thinking about the balance of power issues and finding continuity of horizontal and vertical relationships that Chris highlighted. So one consideration is that US stakeholders are already potentially far more used to operating within these collaborative governance types of regimes, and more comfortable engaging in these spaces, which embeds kind of an inherent power dynamic between US and Mexican stakeholders participating. And another challenge is just trying to find your appropriate counterpart on the other side of the border across these different governmental levels if the way that functions and decision-making power are organized in fundamentally different ways. And so we've seen this in interviews and meeting with different stakeholders along the border and the frustrations that they found in the ways that they are used to working within their own countries, not finding that same connectivity when they're working across the border. So collaborative governance between the US and Mexico has this distinct flavor that is outside of the norm of what we observed in these other transboundary contexts around the world. And yet, use of these collaborative approaches is growing and has delivered some real benefits, as I'll come along to in a minute. And I want to focus on some of the design considerations that can help collaborative institutions in a transboundary context to try and manage some of these different challenges. So the first thing I thought I would put out there to understand is the core issues that institutions that are managing across the US-Mexico border have to balance when they're engaging in a new collaboration that will bring diverse stakeholders to the negotiation table. So on the one hand, they need to design the collaboration in such a way that it represents the problem at hand that they're trying to solve and engages all of the relevant stakeholders in its resolution. But depending on the problem, this can mean potentially having a very, very large group of stakeholders at the table, as we saw in that great photo of all of the stakeholders of the Colorado River sat around that huge table. It very quickly can become a very complex process that involves very high administrative and coordination costs. And also, because we have the emphasis of reaching consensus through collaborative processes, each additional stakeholder that sat at that table represents a potential veto to any group decisions that we're coming to. So this balance between appropriately representing the problem, ensuring that we're representing all of the stakeholder interests, but also managing the complexity of the collaboration is an important one to get right. And then the other salient balance is in a transboundary context, we're thinking about respecting the necessary constraints of national sovereignty and the sole right of national governments to be making decisions in a foreign policy space, alongside providing enough space for stakeholders at the subnational levels to be able to actually meaningfully contribute to decision making and have that room to innovate and find different ways of working together across the border. And there's a risk that if this balance isn't right, then stakeholders can feel that, what is the point of participating in this collaboration? Is it just lip service to inclusion? How is what we're doing feeding through into real decisions? And I think this can be a challenge sometimes in the pace of change that stakeholders can expect at the very local levels and the realities of the pace of change in decision making when we get to needing Congress to act, which has been a particular challenge for on the US side in recent years, as I'm sure we're all very familiar. So to help try to balance between these priorities and foster these types of institutional environments that are going to build trust, manage power dynamics, and provide the space for innovation, transboundary institutions can pull various design levers in the way that they set up these collaborative governance institutions. So I want to share a little bit about how the IBWC as an institution has approached designing its collaborative processes in the Tijuana and the Colorado River basins, as well as drawing on what we learned collectively from that global study, and how international river institutions worldwide are tackling these challenges in the ways that they're designing their collaborations. So just for a little bit of context on these two river basins, for those who are unfamiliar, the IBWC established binational collaborative groups of stakeholders in both basins, initially in the Colorado River through Minute 319 in 2012, and subsequently extended it through Minute 323. And this was to address the issue of increasing water conservation in the agreements between U.S. and Mexico, and providing water for the environment to restore both riparian and estuarine ecology in the border and the river delta region, which had not been a consideration in that original water allocation of 1.5 million acre-feet. So stakeholders that were brought on board to this collaborative group included environmental NGOs, academics, state and federal agencies. And this group, as Andrea mentioned in the Colorado River panel, was successful in implementing additional conservation measures and establishing environmental flows, which led to the Colorado River water actually reaching the delta for the first time in decades in 2014. And then in the Tijuana River, Minute 320 was signed between the U.S. and Mexico in 2015. And this established binational collaborative groups focused on addressing the challenges of transboundary water quality, sedimentation, and solid trash and waste that was traversing the border through the Tijuana River channel and tributary canyons on the border between San Diego and the city of Tijuana. And this group also included environmental NGOs, local, state, and federal governments and agencies. And they were successful in establishing new binational monitoring studies and data sharing, and contributed to a raised profile of the Tijuana River pollution issues, which ultimately led to action that had been long coming at the federal level. So important strides forward were made in both of these collaborations, but not without plenty of challenges along the way, and both with further to go in their respective missions as well. So I want to broaden a little bit here and discuss what did we learn from studying the institutional design of collaborations worldwide that have relevance for this U.S. Mexico context, not only for these collaborations through the IBWC, but thinking more generally as well into other sectors that are cooperating across the border. So a first observation from this study was the importance of participant selection processes. And on the right-hand side, you have the global breakdown of what types of stakeholders are represented in transboundary river collaborations all around the world. So that's the overall breakdown. And then on the left-hand side, we have the breakdown for these two IBWC collaborations in the Tijuana and the Colorado River. So I do want to highlight that, the composition of stakeholders is dictated by the problem context, so there's no necessarily right or wrong way for the overall distribution of stakeholders, and just because the U.S.-Mexico composition doesn't necessarily look like the global case is not something to necessarily draw conclusions from. But more importantly, from a design perspective, what we found was that the way that stakeholders were selected for participation could be very impactful. And for transboundary institutions like the IBWC, you can either nominate exactly which stakeholders you want to participate, or you can have an open application process where anybody who wants to participate can apply and then select from that group. And we found that these lead institutions like the IBWC sometimes had blind spots if they were using a direct nomination process around the role that certain stakeholder groups could play in these negotiations. And these blind spots were particularly pronounced worldwide when we were looking at indigenous groups, the private sector, and disadvantaged communities. And so thinking about that selection process can be incredibly important to how we understand the problem and what types of perspectives are being brought to the collaboration. A second finding was the importance of the minutiae of process design, or how the work of collaboration actually gets done. And I think this is something that is very easily overlooked. As I mentioned, this is the micro level of when and where meetings are being held, who sets the agenda, the order of how stakeholders are speaking in a meeting. And these are ways that institutional design really shapes the micro interactions between collaboration participants and can be really quite impactful for how we establish trust and especially manage power dynamics between different stakeholders. And this has been evidenced in a variety of different studies. So we found worldwide, and including in the U.S. Mexico case, that many times these types of design features were unformalized and not really on the radar of institutions as they were designing their collaborative processes. And it really represents a missed opportunity to be more intentional in how the character of the collaboration will be embedded in that day in, day out interactions of the stakeholders. And then finally, as I mentioned briefly, managing expectations around decision-making and the pace of change in a transboundary context for collaboration stakeholders is a real challenge. Because of these constraints around national sovereignty, usually collaborative groups are not the ones making final decisions in a transboundary context. They're developing recommendations which will then be put to the consideration of transboundary commissions or national governments. Stakeholders at the subnational level are also able to coordinate actions among themselves at that more kind of localized level. But often there is some need for direct agreement and action from the state, such as, for example, in the Colorado River, we've had actions to do more infrastructural interventions like lining canals in Mexico to minimize water loss. But then we've also had things that were done through coordination with stakeholders, like the creation of restoration sites along the river through the work of environmental NGOs at the grassroots level. So to manage these expectations, there needs to be a very clear process and communication about how the outputs of collaboration are going to be used and considered by high-level authorities, as well as that realistic pace of change of decision-making at the national level, and what is in and out of scope for what commissions and governments are actually able to do, and where the limitations are to that, which can be a difficult part of the collaboration to communicate. So just click through those. And so just to conclude and summarize, reflect on the experience of designing collaborative transboundary institutions on the U.S. Mexico border. As I mentioned, collaborative governance approaches is a growing area of focus worldwide for transboundary regions, and thinking about how you do formal collaboration well in transboundary contexts and what are the unique challenges is a growing and very active area of research. The U.S. Mexico border really is one of the most advanced in the world when it comes to doing this type of work, this deep collaboration in the environment and water policy space in particular. But these institutions on the border are working in quite an unusual context of these quite large asymmetries that we have between the U.S. and Mexico, which poses additional challenges. And I think it's a testament to kind of how innovative the culture along the border region is that we are still able to have these close collaborations that are being pursued in spite of these differences. But it does mean that institutions have to be particularly mindful about how they design collaborative processes to manage these power dynamics and provide these stable connections and long-term connections that are necessary for making real change. So while there's been great progress in the Tijuana River and the Colorado River basins, there is more that can be achieved as we go to a more water and resource scarce future in the border region to engage with the priorities of a broader range of stakeholders and unlock more opportunities for innovation in different sectors. And with that, I will conclude my comments and hand over to our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Blas and the other organizers for having me here. It's been a tremendous day, enlightening conversations. And I have the privilege of being the last one today, so the bar has been set high for me. But anyway, thank you again. I've been asked by Blas to tell you a little bit about NatBank, what we do, how we facilitate the collaboration that has been discussed previously, and also what our vision is on the border regarding challenges and opportunities. So with that, let me just start with a little bit of context. We were created back in 1994 in the context of NAFTA. We're not part of the NAFTA agreement, but we have our own binational agreement as part of that negotiation, if you will. And what makes us interesting and certainly very unique back then was the unique mandate of working on environmental issues. And that mandate specifically is to finance environmental infrastructure projects along the U.S. Mexico border that of course advance not only environmental protection, but also the well-being of people. And the reason for this is that back then there was the fear or the belief that NAFTA, the economic integration, was going to bring people to the border and create more pressures on the environment and the infrastructure, which happened to be true as we've seen with some other presentations regarding the amount of population, of economic growth and dynamism in the region. And again, we were defined then as a border institution. The border has been established as 100 kilometers, 62 miles to the north, and 300 kilometers to the south into Mexico. We are equally owned by both governments. We were capitalized by both governments. I'll talk a little bit later about how we get the financing, but for now, we just say that capital came in equal parts from the countries. We have an office in San Antonio, Texas, as well as an office in Juarez, Mexico. Before I continue, when we were created, the NatBank was created at the same time as the Border Environment Corporation Commission, or the BEC, which some of you might have heard of. And at that time, something innovative was that the BEC was the watchdog, maybe, of the financing of the NatBank. In other words, the BEC had to analyze and certify, which is a term we use, or approve, the project so that they could be financed by NatBank. So it was a nice checks and balances at the time. It was innovative. But in 2017, it was decided to merge the institutions and to streamline the approval processes in general. So the BEC continues to function, in essence, now as part of the bank. And in fact, my role as the Chief Environmental Officer is really to oversee and to ensure that environmental integrity and the adherence to the mandate of the bank. And another interesting governance issue, feature is that I report to the board. I'm selected by the board, and that creates some autonomy from the managing director as well regarding the direction of the bank. We have a strong Moody's rating. Not many bankers here, but this is important because this allows us to, with the limited capital that we have and the support of the governments, it allows us to raise more money out in the capital markets, having a good rate, which happens to be higher than Mexico's sovereign credit rating, allows us to raise money relatively inexpensive, then we can lend to our project sponsors. Again, the governance of the bank is obviously formed by both governments. On the U.S. side, we have the Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, and the Administrator of EPA. And of course, their Mexican counterparts at the federal level. But also something innovative at the time, and maybe still innovative, is the fact that we have two representatives from the border regions. One is a representative from a state, and in our case, we just, or the board, I should say, actually the president, maybe now that I think about it, just named a new state representative for the U.S., who is a congresswoman from the Texas legislature from El Paso. And then we have a representative from the public at large, in the case of the U.S. being a former senator of the California legislature. Again, briefly, the jurisdiction, the 100 miles to the north and the 300 miles to the south. As you can see here, the total population is upwards of 24 million people, if I recall correctly, 22 million or so, which makes it a medium-sized country, if you think about it. You know, it's a sizable population. We have major urban cities on both sides, but perhaps more on the Mexican side, the capitals of the states, cities like Tijuana and Hermosillo here in Sonora, Juarez, but even capital cities like Chihuahua or Monterrey, in the case of Nuevo León, are part of the border region, which are not what you would typically consider border communities like Nogales or Tijuana would be, but certainly given the integration, the commercial integration, part of the broader border region. So with this slide, I'd like to combine a little bit what we do with also some of the achievements we've had, but also importantly, what we see as opportunities or challenges for the border region. And as you can imagine, water is at the forefront of our focus. When we were created, of course, water infrastructure, particularly sanitation, was a big concern for the U.S. The lack of universal access to water, drinking water, wastewater collection, wastewater treatment. On the U.S. side, of course, but also on the American side, it's kind of surprising to see some of the needs of communities, what is referred to as colonias, along the border with lacking access to basic services. So that was really the, back then, 30 years ago, the focus of the bank, a lot of it. We were able, of course, with the support of other entities, the federal governments, the state and local governments, to really improve the conditions of basic infrastructure. Now we see on the Mexican side the coverage of the drinking water system close to universal, at least in urban centers. I must clarify that. But also the amount of wastewater treatment, or the percentage of wastewater being treated now, has gone from the mid 30% to the 90% or so. So there's been some progress there. However, some of that infrastructure that we financed 20, 30 years ago, it's finding the end of its useful life, so we see a lot of needs in rehabilitation. We continue to have some pockets of unserved communities, some areas with deficient wastewater treatment, and that's what I refer to loosely as the legacy environmental or water issues that we have. But then we also have emerging issues, which we've talked about this morning, just climate change, pressure for the resource, incredible population and economic growth. So something we're trying to focus now on is conservation, but also the development of new water sources. And of course, reuse is paramount, and where appropriate, seawater desalination, and even just brackish groundwater desalination. Conservation, of course, being part of that equation. We talked about how 70–80% of the water is used in agriculture, depending on where you are. So a lot of opportunities there for conservation. And stormwater is something that is lacking mostly on the Mexican side. And as dry as is here, the periods of storms can create some havoc. And we see that also as a tool for adapting to climate change. Solid waste, the focus so far has been on basic infrastructure collection and proper disposal. We've tried to move more into methane capture, recycling, and so forth. This is an area where, as a bank, being public, being nonprofit, we still need to recover our money. It's a very difficult sector to have bankable projects that can pay back their loans, so we try to address this by leveraging some grants that I'll talk about in a minute. These two sectors, water and solid waste, is what we consider the core sectors. That's why we were created. But the needs and the agenda evolve. I did a master's degree at Stanford in environmental engineering 30 years ago. Never took a climate change class. I don't know if that was because I was not visionary enough, or they weren't as widely, the topic as widely discussed as today, but that was not really the mainstream conservation at the time. Of course it is now. So moving to the right of the slide, what are we trying to do now as a bank? Air quality, and here I'm mixing both local pollution with greenhouse gas emissions. We're trying to focus more of our effort in the mobility space, both by creating public transportation, public infrastructure, and make those vehicles, public buses and so forth, as clean as possible. Electrifying buses, particularly in Mexico, is not easy, but we're about to finance our first purchase of 10 electric buses for the city of Tijuana, which doesn't sound like much, and it is not much, but what is important here is that this creates the basis for the institutional basis for additional improvements in the vehicles down the road. Border crossing is a big issue. I have the statistics for Nogales, 20,000 trucks a day crossing the border. Tremendous amounts of local emissions, forget about greenhouse gases, just local pollution, diesel trucks. This is an issue that is linked with environmental justice. You know, a lot of the neighborhoods around the bridges are vulnerable in one way or another. Nogales, of course, I don't have the figures, but it's a lot of trucks as well crossing the produce. We're trying to work on improving that, electrifying trucks, but also expediting the flow of traffic by making soft improvements in the inspection facilities and so forth. You can have trucks idling for hours sometimes. So just streamlining that flow would create a lot of benefits in terms of reducing emissions. Energy, we have been very instrumental since the 2010s as Mexico liberalized and then deliberalized the energy sector. We funded quite a few wind and solar projects throughout the border region, a lot of projects in Texas, a couple of solar projects here in Arizona, in California. And then, of course, where we live, where we play, where we work is mostly in cities, even though this is a rural conference. So we're trying to do more in terms of urban development. I mentioned public transportation, but also just the built environment, trying to finance efficient buildings for residents, for clinics. I don't know if you heard about LEED certification, you know, try to improve the performance of the buildings and so forth. And then last but not least, sustainable production. We talked about how Mexico's become the #1 trading partner of the U.S. in the last couple of months. So the amount of pressure, we see a lot of demand for industrial parks and just logistics and so forth. So how do we make all that more efficient? And I've been told that I have like 3 minutes left. How do we do this briefly? So we have loans being a bank. We can lend to the public sector, to private sponsors, and to public-private partnerships. We still have to recover that money, so we do have an interest on it, but we can become a more feasible solution by extending our tenors to 30 years, to providing grace periods, to helping with the structuring and the technical analysis. A lot of these projects, the commercial banks are not ready to participate in, or they will provide a loan for 5, 7, 8 years when the repayment period has to be longer. So that's where we come in. Not all cities need us. You know, San Diego wouldn't need us. El Paso barely needs us, but this is a lot of focus for smaller communities and Mexican communities. We also have a couple of grants programs. The bigger one is the Border Environment Infrastructure Fund. This is a program appropriated annually by Congress. The money goes to EPA, and then we administer the program for EPA. These monies can be spent on the U.S. side or in Mexico. And talking about binational collaboration, we do a lot of the coordination to spend the U.S. money in Mexico. The Mexican government is obligated to match every U.S. dollar at least 1-to-1. In reality, we see a leverage of 1-to-2 or 2 pesos. I mean, $1 to $2 from Mexico. And a lot of these programs is really focused on transboundary flows. You mentioned the Tijuana River, Nogales, Naco, communities that have contaminated water flowing into the U.S. or the Rio Grande. That is really the focus of that program. We also fund a program for smaller communities or more impoverished communities with our own retained earnings for water, wastewater, and solid waste. And then last but not least, the technical assistance and the hand-holding and the accompaniment of the project development is crucial, particularly for smaller communities on both sides of the border. So our technical assistance provides monies for studies, design, environmental clearance documents, rate studies in the case of water, as well as some training for operators. Just to move on, we've financed about 300 projects in our history. We've invested about $3 billion of our money, but the total cost of these projects is closer to $11 billion. So we have about 1 to 3 leverage for every dollar we invest. These leverage come mostly from the private sector, particularly for energy projects that tend to be privately sponsored. And you can see here some numbers for Arizona and Sonora. Just briefly, we need to track everything we do, so I won't bore you with the details, but we have to provide to our stakeholders, the government, the public in general, as closely as possible the impact of our projects. We anticipate the impact before we approve the projects, and then we follow through to try to measure how those impacts are being met or not. All this also, this is, let me just move on, just with some representative projects. This is the slide we have for Arizona. We've done 25 projects. You can see most of them are in the water, wastewater sector. You can see to the right, they tend to be in smaller communities, the Bisbees and the Douglas and so forth. Nogales is important, as I said, because of the binational nature of the flows. We have the Santa Cruz River crossing from Mexico into the U.S. There's a wastewater treatment plant on the U.S. side that treats Mexican wastewater, so a lot of projects in Nogales. We have a couple of 2 or 3 larger solar farms near the Tucson area and so forth. And again, we try to measure the impact of what we do. So, you know, this is what we have in Arizona. Just a geographic view. In the case of Sonora, we have 37 projects. Again, about a little bit less than half of them have to do with water and wastewater sanitation. But then we also have some pretty large solar projects. I think one of the solar projects we financed maybe about 5 years ago at the time was the largest solar farm in Latin America. We've also working with cities like Hermosillo, and again, trying to pivot more from the water sector to also cities and industrial manufacturing and so forth. The impacts in Mexico are really remarkable. You can see here the amount of wastewater treatment capacity built through these projects is upwards of 80 million gallons a day of wastewater that is now being treated. Again, the challenge is that, you know, 5 to 10% that is always very hard to eliminate, and also keeping up with the aging and the operation and maintenance of the facilities. Some other numbers there, I think the solar capacity in solely Mexico, 560 megawatts, is also pretty significant. And then we try to link those to either liters per second or tons of CO2 reduced or eliminated and so forth. Let me just touch on a couple of things. This is a project for Laredo, not near to where we are, but again, a lot of what we do is bringing people together. The situation in Laredo is just a bigger Nogales, where you have wastewater flowing into the Rio Grande, untreated or with insufficient treatment. And a lot of what we do is really to bring people together. We created an $80 million rehabilitation project that, as you can see in the lower part, includes people, money from us, the EPA, the local utilities, the state, the federal, the Water Commission of Mexico at the federal level, and then the IBWC. So the amount of effort going into get these agreements really requires a lot of coordination. That's a picture with the governor and the mayor of Nuevo Laredo. So this is just the way the collaboration you were talking about works in the real world. This is another interesting project in which we finance a wind farm in the state of Baja California in Mexico, but the energy is actually being sold to the U.S., to San Diego Gas and Electric. And in addition to the environmental benefits of this, something that I find interesting is that the land where this wind farm is located, it's an ejido, a communal land, and Sempra Energy then provides a lease for the ejidatarios or the owners of this land, which really have a very, very low sources of income. You know, it's a pretty rugged terrain, so they have these payment for the leases for, I don't know if it's maybe 20 years or 30 years or something along those lines, in another example of bilateral collaboration. And last but not least, I mentioned the border crossings are an issue. They're congested. We see a lot of trends for nearshoring and additional connection of the supply chains, and therefore more traffic. We are creating partnerships with the state of California and Baja California to electrify the fleets, and this is building upon strict California regulations that will prohibit fuel burning trucks over time. We're also set up, we have some technical assistance funds created for a pilot trucking program in Nogales with electric trucks. We're paying for the charging station. Someone else is bringing in the trucks. We haven't quite worked out all the kinks, but this is something we are trying to do. We also host a fund to monitor air quality in the El Paso Juarez region. Again, these are perhaps kind of small but very concrete examples of binational collaboration. The issue here was how can Ciudad Juarez maintain their air quality monitoring stations over time. Operation and maintenance is an issue. So we created a fund at the bank. We're receiving money from EPA, from the state of Texas, from private philanthropies, and from ourselves. And we've been able to expand the air quality monitoring system and also pay for the operation and maintenance for the last 2 years for those systems. With that, I'm being told that I'm out of time, but I think I kind of covered the looking ahead with my previous slide. Thank you.
Catch up on time. We have about 15 minutes. So I'm going to ask a really quick question to each one of you and then open to the floor. Chris, you talk about the energy trade. A lot of it is fossil fuels. Should there be new governance structures let the markets play its way, or the U.S. should also help Mexico foster clean energy sources, given that has been lagging in the last few years? So I'll ask the three questions really quick. So,
okay.
Gemma, you talked about collaboration around the world. Could you talk a little bit about the Canadian and U.S. collaboration, just a comparative with the U.S. Mexico border? And Salvador, you are in the trenches. You go to these communities, and are you really seeing something happening because of nearshoring? And you know, there's like on the Mexican side, we mentioned this need for new infrastructure. I was just recently in a conference hosted by the Energy Cluster in Nuevo León, and the complaint was there's no energy transmission, there's no new supply of energy, and we need clean energy if we're going to be supplying, you know, decarbonized products. So maybe comment on that, and then on the U.S. side, you know, we've been talking about a major project that California is doing in a very disadvantaged area, which is the Salton Sea, the Lithium Valley, create from nothing and a global innovation hub. Are you guys involved in that area? So those are the three questions, and then if you want to start thinking about your questions, please. Chris.
Let me reflect on that briefly, whether energy is somehow different than other environmental resources that we have more experience regulating and managing and building binational partnerships around. And I'm taking the cases of water resources, which is very much a public sector enterprise. Certainly the private sector is involved, but it is much more a government, state, municipality level of service provision. And so it's much more prone to, it's much more susceptible to, it's much more open to, let's say, a regulatory approach. Food is somewhat similar, though different, though producers and consumers are in the private sector, but I do think that there is more ways in which national level, particularly agencies govern food trade and look for phytosanitary controls and so forth. And I think energy perhaps is the least regulated of the three sectors, at least that I've been considering. I think particularly given the link of fossil fuel development in the United States and in Mexico, and the cross-border trade of fossil fuels, and the direct link to climate change and carbon. I think there is an imperative to be much more intentional about the way that trade is conducted, pursued. And I'm not saying there's going to be limits to the way that's done, but I think the environmental controls more broadly from a carbon perspective not only raise the need, I think there's an imperative that we must do a better job at that. Now, I think private sector will continue to develop the way energy is produced and consumed and traded, but I think the public sector needs to play a much more involved role. I'm also curious, partly, and that's maybe your question to Salvador, about the renewables, which is a flip side of that same coin. I think it's also something that we have to think more intentionally about, and taking Gemma's charge to all of us of how do we do better intentional institutional design to build collaborative mechanisms that have positive outcomes while managing some of the negative or the trade-offs associated with that. So I'll leave it at that, but other people may have comments too.
Okay, so your question about the comparison between the US-Canada border and the US Mexico border. It's a really interesting one to see kind of how the US collaborates with its different partners on both borders. I will say I think the US-Canada border, the level that they are at in terms of collaborative approaches for international water management is probably the most advanced in the world today. And, you know, I think they're operating in a very different context with the level of similarity between the two countries and of just how much that eases the gears of cooperation in terms of the symmetry and the similarities in the ways that they work. But they are also really interesting in that they have watershed boards for every single watershed that is shared between the US and Canada, and most of them are using collaborative processes with different stakeholders from all different sectors. I think they've done a really, really good job of engaging with tribal nations, and again, probably a world leader in this space, by recognizing that tribal nations can't engage on the same level as other stakeholders because they are their own sovereign nations, and so they have to engage in a way that is kind of on a par with the US and Canada, or the US and Mexico on this border. So they've been very intentional about how they engage in that way and build trust over a very long time, and how to think about that partnership. So yeah, all that is to say, they have developed, very intentional ways of thinking about this institutional design piece. There's a lot of emphasis on process design. So there is a lot of interesting things to learn from that border, but with the caveat that it is, two very different contexts.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So, is this on? Yeah. I mean, nearshoring is something that is on the newspapers like every day, particularly in Mexico. And always a question we always have is it true? Is it happening? And I think the short answer is yes, right? We see, I think you showed some graphs on the level of investment that has been going on the Mexican side, which is good news from an economic development and an employment creation and quality of life and so forth. But obviously, it brings some of the challenges that I mentioned, mostly water and energy, but also just quality of life, housing and open space and congestion and all that good stuff. So we do see that as a challenge, but also as opportunities for us as a bank. And we're seeing demand for those, for those kinds of investments. Some of it coming from the governments who see that as something that they need to solve. We have high hopes on certain projects we're working on, for example, for water reuse. Cities like Monterrey are trying to get into the indirect potable reuse arena by highly treating wastewater, putting it in a reservoir, and then taking it out and treat it again for potable reuse, in addition to just good old industrial reuse. We are financing a study in Tijuana to do the same for indirect potable reuse. So I think the government is seeing that need and trying to move in that direction. We also see a lot of demand for industrial parks. When we talk to people, they cannot find space. The ability to rent industrial facilities is very limited, and that's also where we see an area for green investments. And this is partly due because corporations have their own climate goals and their own ESG goals, so they need their production chain, their suppliers, to be green. So there's some demand for energy efficiency, water efficiency, and hopefully down the road for circular economy. There's quite a bit of buildings going on, residential buildings. And again, the idea is to start incorporating LEED certifications or EDGE certifications to make them more attractive. I talked about mobility and border crossings as well. So we do see the demand. This is always a half empty, half full glass, of course. So there's a lot of needs. But we hope that we'll be moving, we as a society will be moving in the right direction. Regarding renewables, I think we continue to invest heavily on the U.S. side for renewables, wind and solar. Texas now, I guess, ahead of California in terms of renewables investments. That's become pretty much, pretty commercial operation. So as a development bank, we have a little bit less to do with that. But we have been funding battery storage, which is important to address intermittency of renewables and also to increase efficiency. We hope one day to mimic a lot of what we learned in the Texas electricity market in the early 2010s. We ended up applying in Mexico. So I think battery storage would eventually be applied in Mexico. Without getting into the politics of it, the demand for renewable energy projects in Mexico now, it's low, to say the least. But we do see also some behind-the-meter opportunities with industrial parks and manufacturers tied with battery storage as well.
Great, thank you. So we'll open the floor for questions. Is there any? Bruce, the mic is coming behind you.
So Gemma mentioned, the relationship between national governments and what goes on the border with the subnational entities, including the NADBank. So here's my question. Does the turmoil at the national level in both Mexico and the United States in any way affect the work of collaboration on water and the environment? Or does it actually in other words, does it make it worse, harder to operate? Or does it actually mean that the subnational stuff is more important and you actually end up doing more in the periods of national turmoil?
Well, I would say both. I think definitely, I think the gridlock and challenges that you see at the national level, particularly some of the dynamics in the U.S. in recent years when a lot of the developments with the Tijuana River were happening, definitely impacted how people were able to collaborate. There were recommendations that were coming out of that collaboration that just could not get passed by the national government, and so that sticking point created a lot of conflict and tension for people who are working in the collaboration and frustration at that local level. But equally, it does push the envelope for stakeholders to try and innovate and see what they can do more and more creative ways at these subnational levels. And so I think that's kind of part of why that setting of expectations and understanding kind of how those national government limitations can play into it can be really important at the start of the collaboration in order to set the framing for how stakeholders can be thinking about what are the viable ways to solve this problem that we have. And to an extent, it depends on the nature of the problem as well. Like with the Colorado River, there was more progress that could be done without the engagement of national governments in terms of what the NGOs were able to do to be doing conservation on the ground, and that didn't require any kind of high-level permissions, whereas in the Tijuana River, the nature of the problems meant that we needed big infrastructure spending, and that required money to be coming from the national governments, and that was kind of the crux of the issue. There was only so far that what the subnational actors could do.
Another question? Okay, we have a couple minutes, so if there's no questions, maybe do anyone want to react to what you heard from your fellow panelists?
I was very pleased to hear that there's a lot of investment in renewable energy at the border with NADBank. I agree with what you said, Salvador, that at some point when investment opportunities like that become mature, the private sector will step in. I still think there's some role for incentive programs to, guide the way investments move, and this is partly my reflection on what is the role of public sector institutions and the governments, and the national governments particularly, but I mean also at state level. But I wasn't aware, and I think those are some new developments. So the same way you could sort of say there's the hockey stick diagram of fossil fuel trade across the border, there's also sort of maybe a ramping up of renewable energy activity, at least through NADBank and so forth. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. And by the way, we do see a lot, talk about the role of governments with the IRA and all that, we do see quite a bit of, quite an uptick on the demand for just green projects in general, certainly renewables, right? But we see it in ports, and again, the role that the states can play for electromobility, like in the case of California, with their incentives program and so forth, it's something that we see as something that is needed. Sometimes you know, the gap financially to make the projects feasible is not there yet. So I think the government still have a role to play with that.
So if not, we'll finish this on time, and please join me in thanking our panel.